My name is Jane. Standing in the packed church on Christmas Eve, I watched as my mother, Margaret, stood at the podium, her voice filled with false emotion as she spoke about family and forgiveness. It was a performance, a carefully crafted lie that she'd been telling for years. I remembered the last time I spoke to her, 8 years ago, when I was alone in the ER, hemorrhaging and scared, and she chose a party over me. It all started when I was 26, working night shifts at a local hospital. I'd just graduated at the top of my nursing cohort and had 3 job offers on the table. I was excited to share the news with my family, but my mother, Margaret, was more concerned about my older sister, Emily. Emily was 4 years older than me and the apple of my mother's eye. Margaret posted pictures of Emily's every achievement on social media, while I was rarely mentioned. My father, Henry, was a quiet man. He worked as an accountant and spent most of his free time in the garage, listening to baseball games on the radio. At the dinner table, when my mother talked over me, he'd look at me with a silent apology in his eyes, but he never said a word. I used to think that being quiet meant being strong, that if I just worked hard enough, they'd finally see me. But I was wrong. That fall, I found out I was pregnant. The father had left me a few weeks earlier, leaving me alone and scared. But I was determined to keep the baby. I called my mother to tell her the news, but instead of support, I got silence. She was more worried about Emily's upcoming wedding and didn't want anything to overshadow it. A few weeks later, I had a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. I drove myself to the ER, and by the time I got there, I was hemorrhaging. The doctor told me I needed emergency surgery and asked if there was someone they could call. I called my mother, but she was at Emily's engagement party and couldn't leave. She told me to stop being dramatic and that the doctors knew what they were doing. I went into surgery alone, with only a kind nurse named Sarah holding my hand. When I woke up, the baby was gone, and there was no one in the room. My mother didn't call to check on me, and when she finally did, 3 days later, she didn't ask how I was. Instead, she told me not to use the miscarriage to guilt-trip anyone. I was heartbroken. I felt like I'd lost not only my baby but also my family. I changed my phone number, deactivated my Facebook, and moved to a small town 4 hours away. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. 2 years later, I received a letter from my aunt, Carol. She was my father's younger sister and the only one in the family who had ever shown me any support. In the letter, she told me that my mother had been telling people I'd left because of a mental health crisis. She'd written a letter to the pastor at our church, saying that I'd been diagnosed with a severe personality disorder and that I was a danger to myself. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that my mother would do something like that. I decided to focus on my career and build a new life for myself. I applied to a nurse practitioner program at the state university and got in on the first try. For the next 2.5 years, I worked full-time and went to school full-time. I hardly had time to think about my family. The day I graduated, I looked out at the audience and saw rows of families, but there was no one there for me. I told myself it didn't matter, that the degree was for me, not for an audience. But deep down, I still hoped that someone would be there to support me. Fast forward to last Christmas Eve. I was 34, living in a small Connecticut town. I'd just finished a 10-hour shift at the clinic and was looking forward to a glass of wine and some peace and quiet. My phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Carol. She said she had something important to tell me and needed to come over. I was curious but also a little nervous. Aunt Carol had always respected my space, so for her to want to come in person on Christmas Eve, it had to be something serious. When the doorbell rang, I opened the door, expecting to see Aunt Carol, but instead, I saw a little girl standing there. She had dark blonde hair and big brown eyes, and she was holding a book against her chest. "Are you Aunt Jane?" she asked. I was stunned. No one had called me aunt in 8 years. I couldn't speak. She held out the book and said, "Grandpa said to give this to you. He said you'd know what it means." I took the book from her hands. It was heavy, leather-bound, and had my father's handwriting on the cover, "For Jane, everything." Behind the girl, Aunt Carol stepped out of the car. She looked older and more tired than I remembered. "Her name is Lily," Aunt Carol said. "She's Emily's daughter, your niece." I was in shock. I had a niece, and I didn't even know it. Aunt Carol told me that my father was in the hospital, and he'd asked her to bring Lily and the album to me. I invited them inside and sat on the floor, opening the album. The first page was a blurry photo of my graduation. I looked closer and realized that it had been taken from the back row of the auditorium. My father had been there. I turned the page and saw a photo of me outside the clinic, laughing with my coworker. There was a bank transfer receipt for $200, sent monthly for 48 months, from Aunt Carol's account, but with a note in my father's hand saying, "From Dad." I realized that all those years, my father had been supporting me, even though he couldn't tell me. I turned another page and saw a stack of Christmas cards, handwritten but never mailed. Each one started with the same words, "Dear Jane, I'm sorry I'm not brave enough to send this." I closed the album and started to cry. Aunt Carol explained that my mother controlled everything in the family, including my father's bank accounts and phone. She'd threatened to cut off my father's access to Lily if he contacted me. That's why he'd had to be so secretive. I asked Aunt Carol if my mother knew where I lived. She hesitated and then said that she'd accidentally mentioned my town to my mother 2 years ago. My mother had said, "Good. Let her rot in that little town. At least she's not here embarrassing us." I was angry, but I was also determined. I decided to go to the Christmas Eve service at the church, where my mother was giving a speech about family and forgiveness. I wanted to confront her and set the record straight. I drove to the church and sat in the back row. When my mother took the podium, she started her speech, talking about how she'd always kept the door open for me and how she'd never stopped praying for me to come home. I listened in silence, my anger boiling inside me. When she finished, she saw me sitting in the back row. Her smile froze, and for a moment, I saw the real her, the woman who had abandoned me when I needed her most. But then the mask slid back on, and she walked towards me, arms open wide, tears streaming down her face. "Jane, my baby, you're home," she said. I stood up and faced her. "Hello, Mom," I said. She tried to hug me, but I stepped back. "I didn't come here for a reunion, Mom. I came here because Dad asked me to." I took out the album and set it on the back of the pew in front of me. I told my mother about all the things my father had done for me, how he'd been at my graduation, how he'd sent me money every month, and how he'd written me Christmas cards but never mailed them. My mother tried to deny it, but I opened the album to the last page and showed her the letter she'd written to the pastor. I read it aloud, and the church went silent. People started to realize that they'd been lied to. Pastor Mark stood up and confirmed that he'd received the letter and that he'd kept the original because something about it didn't feel right. He said that he'd been waiting for me to come forward and tell the truth. Then, Emily's husband, David, stood up and said that he'd heard Emily tell my mother not to go to the hospital when I was in the ER. He said that he couldn't keep quiet anymore, that he wanted to teach his daughter, Lily, to stand up for what was right. My mother was furious. She tried to defend herself, but no one was listening. She finally realized that she'd lost, and she walked out of the church alone. After the service, Pastor Mark came over to me and shook my hand. He said, "Welcome home, Jane." Other people in the church came up to me and apologized for believing my mother's lies. I drove to the hospital to see my father. When I walked into his room, he looked at me and started to cry. "I'm sorry, Jane. I should have been braver," he said. I took his hand and said, "You were there, Dad. In every back row, in every envelope, you were there." He told me that he'd filed for legal separation from my mother and that he'd set up a trust for me and Lily. I was overwhelmed. I realized that my father had been fighting for me all these years, even though he couldn't show it. In the weeks that followed, things changed. My mother was asked to step back from her organizational responsibilities at the church. Some family members still sided with her, but enough of them believed me and reached out to me. Emily sent me a card saying she was sorry. I'm not sure if she really meant it, but I'm willing to give her a chance. My father and I are building a new relationship, slowly but surely. And Lily, my beautiful niece, has become a big part of my life. This Christmas was different. I didn't sign up for the overnight shift. I was home, surrounded by people who love me. My father, Lily, Aunt Carol, and David were all there. We laughed, we ate, and we celebrated. I've learned that blood doesn't always mean family. Sometimes, you have to walk away from the people who hurt you to find peace. And sometimes, the people who love you are the ones you least expect. If you've ever felt invisible to the people who are supposed to love you the most, I want you to know that you're not alone. Walking away isn't giving up. It's sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do. And if there's someone who's been loving you from the back row, don't be too proud to let them in when they finally step forward. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonates with you, I'd love to hear yours. Comment below and let me know if you've ever had to walk away from family to find peace, or if someone has loved you from the back row without you knowing. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. Merry Christmas, wherever you are.